that is being adopted.
I actually told the noble and learned Lord Hope of Craighead that he should not have helped the government, but I'm prepared to forgive him from a sense of generosity, because I know he was trying to help, but actually it didn't actually help at all. Now, this opening speech by the Minister is quite interesting because it lasted nearly 9 minutes, and it focused almost entirely on the what the police were going to do and what the protesters were going to do, and it avoided the talk of the constitutional novelty that the government has actually introduced. And for me, this is a make or break moment for democracy. It's a crossroads that we really have to face up to. Because in spite of what the noble Lord Coker was saying about respecting conventions, the fact is the government has not respected our conventions. Okay. So there are two issues at stake here. First, the suppression of freedom, with a measure that your Lordship's House rejected as unreasonable only very recently. And in some ways more seriously, secondly, a government move that sets a precedent that the government can use secondary legislation to overrule Parliament's will, as expressed in votes in primary legislation. Now, this means that any future minister, at any time, could decide to change any law in any way. Now, this to me is deeply, deeply disturbing. And I think that we are going to perhaps hear from other people, I hope, who find it disturbing as well. Now, the Shadow Attorney General has said that we have to stick to the conventions and allow this statutory instrument to pass, but that argument seems to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the conventions. By convention, your Lordship's House does not block primary legislation, but this isn't primary legislation. Your Lordship's House can and does and has blocked statutory instruments. I recognise that there's no convention that the government cannot use a statutory instrument to overturn parliamentary votes on primary legislation, but that convention doesn't exist because no government has ever tried to do this before. What we're facing here is a novel issue, a turning point for our parliamentary democracy, and the decision in your Lordship's House on the following question will establish a new constitutional understanding. The key question is, should the government be allowed to overturn parliamentary votes on primary legislation by using secondary legislation? That's the question that we have to think about here today. We've talked before in your Lordship's House about our discontent about overreach by secondary legislation. And I just ask you, is this not the day to act on this? And if we refuse to act today, when are we going to act? The Labour Party has tabled a motion to regret, and regret is what I believe we'll all experience in the future if we fail to support this fatal motion today. The whole country will have cause to regret the further erosion of the right to protest, which is part of our basic British way of life, and the enfeebling of this House, which many in this House might regret as well. We will regret it when the ministers regularly start to use their power under secondary legislation to overturn existing laws that Parliament has debated and voted for. We will regret it when we read the headlines about the police arresting a group of parents and their children while protesting about pollution outside their school. And what about the people, the community up in Stone in Staffordshire, just the last week, who protested about having HS2 HGVs rushing past their houses 42 times a day? They protested quite hard, and I think actually they would have fallen foul from this particular piece of law. Or arresting people holding a vigil for a victim of police violence, which of course has happened. We will definitely regret it when we hear about a big march against a government policy, as when 1 million of us protested about the Iraq War, and the police then have to say, sorry, that protest is banned because it may cause more than minor disruption. That's a very low bar. This is an authoritarian law that hands power to decide what is a good protest or a bad protest over to the police and the Home Office. It erodes the rule of law because any protest will now be permitted only at the discretion of the police, rather than being a fundamental right that can be interfered with only in limited and proportionate circumstances. And it's being enacted in an authoritarian manner by ministerial decree. If we let the government overturn votes by ministerial decree, then what is the point of this House and all our work? Yeah. And if the justification for allowing the government to act in this way is that your Lordship's House is not elected, then who is left to defend Parliament and the UK's uncodified constitution against encroachment by an out-of-control government? This isn't a one-off. It's part of a trend of legislation that undermines parliamentary democracy. In the last 4 years, we've seen a whole series of skeleton bills pass through Parliament that hand over powers and discretion to ministers to make decisions with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. These bills that hand over the power to ministers to make and amend rules and laws have become the norm. It means that in recent years, we've seen a major shift in power away from Parliament, giving it instead to Whitehall. If the government are allowed to do this today, then the precedent will be set. They will do it again next month, and then the next government will do it as well. And parliamentary democracy will seep away until this House is less than a talking shop. In a few days, more than 55,000 people signed a petition that I put out against this legislation. That's a huge number in a brief time, especially on something that appears to be so technical and so small. But the regret motion misses the seriousness of the issues before us and the consequences of allowing this law to pass. If Labour and Lib Dems and Greens and sympathetic crossbenchers and even principled, sympathetic Conservatives, we could beat this, we could defeat it. Yep. It is possible. Yep. Your Lordship has the power, we have the right and the constitutional duty to stop this statutory instrument, which is an assault on democracy. And if not now, when?